The wind shifted across the valley, carrying with it the smell of dust, iron, and something faintly sweet, like blossoms that had bloomed too far from water. He stood still, shoulders tense beneath the weight of silence, while she looked past him toward the horizon as though expecting an answer that the earth itself refused to give. There was nothing but the cliffs, carved by centuries of sun and storms, and the faint sound of wings circling somewhere high above. Yet both of them felt the truth lingering, heavy and undeniable, that this place was not as empty as it seemed. He remembered when the valley had been spoken of only in whispers. Men at the tavern would lower their voices, afraid that even mentioning its name too loud might draw shadows closer. They said the ground itself could remember that it kept secrets buried deep until it was ready to let them surface again. He had laughed once, long ago, at such tales. But now, with the woman beside him and his own pulse echoing like a drum in his ears, he was no longer so quick to dismiss what the old ones had warned. Her eyes caught the fading light, fierce and restless, though her voice was softer than he expected when she finally spoke. She told him that her people had once lived near these ridges before they were driven out, before the nights filled with fire and the river turned black with ashes. He could feel the weight of her words pressing between them, a story not only of loss but of something left unfinished. There was no trace of the village now, only scattered stones and the sense that the ground held on to the memory even if no one else did. And yet, she swore she could still hear voices when the wind moved a certain way. He did not want to admit that he had heard them too. Not clearly, not enough to repeat, but enough that sleep had become scarce. Sometimes it was a song, sometimes a warning, sometimes just a name carried faintly like a thread slipping through the air. He thought of telling her, of confessing that his own nights had been haunted since they stepped into this valley. But the words caught in his throat. It was too soon, too dangerous to give shape to the shadows that trailed them. Instead, he asked her why she had chosen him to walk with her here. There were others, stronger men perhaps, men who would not hesitate to raise steel at the first sign of danger. Her gaze flicked to him, sharp yet calm, and she answered that strength meant little without memory. She said he carried something in his eyes that reminded her of the old songs, the ones her grandmother used to sing before the war. It unsettled him because he had no memory of songs, and yet, part of him felt she was not wrong. The sun dipped lower, painting the cliffs with long shadows that looked like figures stretching across the rock. The air grew colder and the silence between them deepened until every small sound became sharper. The scrape of leather, the creak of beads against his chest, her breath drawn slowly as though she measured each inhale for fear of breaking something fragile. He felt the tension rise, the way storms gather long before the first thunder speaks. Something was waiting for them in this place, and neither of them could turn away now. He thought back to the night before they left, when an old man in the village pressed a bundle into his hands. Inside had been dried herbs, a small carving of bone, and a warning. Never forget that the past is not buried. The man's eyes had been clouded, yet steady, as if he knew the path already carved for them. At the time, he wanted to dismiss it as superstition, the rambling of one who had lived too long. But now, with each step further into the valley, the memory of that warning grew louder, as though the old man had known exactly what would be waiting. She walked slightly ahead now, her hair catching the dying light, and he noticed how her hand brushed against the rocks as though she was searching for something. A sign, perhaps, or proof that the stories she carried were not just fragments of memory. He admired her courage, though he knew that courage and desperation often wore the same face. She carried grief like a hidden weapon, sharp and unyielding, and he feared what might happen when it was finally unsheathed. Shadows thickened as night began to stretch its fingers across the sky. They did not speak again for a long time. He could feel the questions rising inside him, yet each one felt too dangerous to ask. Why had she brought him here instead of letting the past remain where it was? What did she expect to find, and what would it cost them when they did? The silence did not hold answers, only more unease, and yet he followed her still. Bound by something he could not quite name. As darkness settled, the valley seemed to change. The stones felt closer, the air heavier, and the ground beneath his boots seemed to hum faintly, as if alive with memory. He could almost imagine the earth breathing, slow and ancient. When he glanced at her, he saw that her eyes were fixed on something ahead, something he could not yet see, but her expression told him that she knew exactly what waited. A strange mix of fear and determination crossed her face, and he realized then that whatever secret lay ahead was tied to her more deeply than he had understood. They stopped at last where the cliffs curved inward, forming a narrow passage. The opening looked like nothing more than shadows at first, yet the closer they came, the more it resembled a doorway carved not by nature, but by hands long gone. His pulse quickened, and the silence seemed to press even harder against his ears. He wanted to speak, to tell her they should turn back, but his voice betrayed him and refused to come. She reached out, fingers trembling slightly, and brushed the edge of the stone as though greeting something familiar. He thought of the old stories again, of places where the living and the dead walked too close together, where memory clung to stone like moss. He thought of the warnings, the whispers, the way every step into this valley had felt heavier than the last. Yet even as fear gripped him, another feeling stirred, a pull, faint but undeniable, urging him to keep going. And in that moment, standing at the edge of the unknown with her beside him, he realized the valley was no longer just her past. It was becoming his as well. The night deepened around them, and the stars began to pierce the sky. The world felt suspended, caught between silence and revelation, and he knew there was no turning back now. Whatever waited beyond that passage, it would change them both. He just did not know yet whether it would bind them closer or tear them apart. The valley stretched before them like a wound that refused to close. Rocks jutted out at sharp angles, their edges glowing faintly in the last spill of sunset, and the air carried a dryness that scraped the throat with every breath. He moved slower now, each step careful, as though the earth itself might split if he pressed too hard. She walked just ahead, her posture stiff but steady, her eyes fixed on something unseen. He could tell she carried a purpose deeper than she had revealed, a reason for bringing him here that went beyond memory or grief. He tried to recall the first time she had spoken of this place. It had been late, the fire burning low, shadows dancing along the wooden walls of the room they had shared. Her voice had been low, almost fragile, when she said the valley was not only a graveyard of her people, but also a doorway. He had not understood then what she meant, nor had he pressed her, but those words clung to him now like smoke that would not wash away. A doorway. To what, he still did not know. The night settled more firmly, stars spilling across the sky one by one, and with the darkness came the faint stirring of sound. At first he thought it was the wind, but then he realized it carried rhythm, like words whispered too softly to catch. He froze, listening, his heart thudding with a force that almost drowned out the sound itself. She did not pause. Instead, she kept moving forward, her expression unreadable, as if the voices were not new to her. When he finally caught up to her, he asked what she heard, but she only shook her head, refusing to speak. His thoughts turned to his own childhood, to the fragments of stories that had reached him in scattered pieces. Tales of men who disappeared in places where stone remembered too much. Warnings of rivers that flowed red not from war but from the earth itself bleeding. He had dismissed those stories as fables, created to keep children from wandering too far. Yet standing here now, with her at his side and the voices brushing his ears, he was no longer certain where story ended and truth began. They stopped at a ridge overlooking a hollow in the land. Below, the ground looked different, darker somehow, as though fire had passed through and scorched the soil so deeply it never recovered. She lowered herself to her knees, pressing her palm flat against the earth, and closed her eyes. He did not interrupt, though unease coiled tight in his chest. After a moment, she opened her eyes again, and there was something fierce within them, something he had never seen before. She said the soil still carried the memory of what was taken. She said it was waiting. He did not ask what it was waiting for. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. Instead, he watched the way her fingers traced the cracks in the dirt, almost tender, as though she were greeting an old friend. He realized then that her connection to this place was not born only from blood or ancestry. It was deeper, more personal, as though some thread tied her spirit to the stones themselves. That thought unsettled him more than the whispers in the air. The hollow seemed to draw them in, the way still water pulls at the feet of anyone who dares step too close. He followed her down, though every instinct screamed to stay back. At the bottom, the air felt heavier, filled with a faint metallic tang that clung to his tongue. She knelt again and brushed aside loose soil until something pale glimmered beneath the surface. His breath caught as he realized it was bone, old and brittle, worn smooth by time. She did not flinch, only stared at it as though confirming something she already knew. He asked her why she had to find this, what it meant, but she gave no answer. Instead, she lifted her gaze to the horizon where the cliffs met the stars. He thought she looked almost like a figure carved from the past, someone pulled out of another time and forced into the present. The silence between them thickened again, filled not with comfort but with questions that had no answers. The hours stretched, and the night grew colder. He built a small fire from the driftwood they had carried, its light flickering against the hollow walls, but even the warmth did little to drive away the chill. She sat close but not too close, her posture still, her eyes lost in the flames. He wondered what she saw there. Perhaps the past replaying itself, or perhaps the faces of those who never left this valley. He wanted to reach for her hand, to anchor her, but something in the sharpness of her gaze held him back. Sleep came to him in fragments, broken by dreams of shadows moving through the rocks, of voices calling his name from places he could not see. Each time he woke, he found her still awake, her eyes reflecting the firelight. It unnerved him, the way she seemed untethered from time itself, as though the night belonged to her in ways it never could to him. He realized then that whatever path she was on, he was only a companion by chance, not by design. And yet he could not leave, not when something in his chest told him this story had already taken root inside him. When the dawn finally broke, painting the sky in muted gold, the valley looked different. The shadows had retreated, but the hollow still carried its weight, as though night had only hidden the truth rather than erased it. She rose slowly, her body stiff from hours without rest, and turned to him with a look that seemed to pierce deeper than words. She said they had to move further, that the hollow was only the beginning. He wanted to protest, to demand answers, but the words died on his lips. There was no turning back now, not for either of them. They climbed through narrow passages between cliffs, the rocks pressing close on either side. Each step echoed faintly, as though the valley itself listened. He kept his hand near the hilt of his blade, though he knew steel would be of little use against whatever forces lingered here. She moved ahead with quiet certainty, her shoulders squared, her breath steady. Watching her, he realized she carried more than just memory. She carried defiance, a refusal to let what was lost remain buried. The path opened at last into a wider clearing, where the ground was marked with patterns too deliberate to be natural. Circles etched into stone, lines connecting them like veins, worn but not erased by time. He stopped, staring, while she stepped forward as though returning to a place she had always known. She knelt and touched one of the circles, and for the first time he thought he saw her hands tremble. She whispered that this was where it began, where the fire had first been set, where the blood had first been spilled. The clearing felt alive in a way that unsettled him. The air hummed faintly, and the silence pressed heavier than before. He could almost feel eyes watching, though there was nothing but stone and sky around them. She closed her eyes again, lips moving in words too soft for him to hear, and the ground seemed to shiver beneath her touch. He stepped closer, uncertain whether to stop her or to protect her from whatever she had awakened, but he could not bring himself to break the moment. The suspense coiled tighter, each breath sharper, each heartbeat louder. He knew they were standing on the edge of something far greater than either of them, something that reached back into the past yet stretched its hand toward the present. And though he could not yet name it, he knew with certainty that once it revealed itself, nothing would ever be the same again. They stayed in the clearing until the wind changed. It came low through the rocks and carried a smell he could not place at first. It was faint, like rain on hot stone, but sharper, as if metal had been heated and cooled again. She lifted her head and said the word he had heard only in broken stories. Forge. He tasted the word in his mouth and felt a tightness spread across his chest. A forge meant hands, and hands meant blame. Fire did not start itself. He crouched by the etched circles and ran his thumb along a groove. The lines were shallow but clean, like a map that had been carved into the ground for those who already knew how to read it. She told him the circles matched the stars during a certain season. Not the season they were in, but a time that came when the river swelled and the jackals stayed far from the ridge. The pattern was a way to call attention up toward the sky and then draw it back down again. Her grandmother used to say the stones and the stars spoke the same language when people listened. He wanted to believe that, but belief was a luxury that had failed him before. They shared dried fruit and water, and then she began to tell more of her past. The story came out in slow parts, as if each piece was a thorn she had to pull free. She had been a child when her family fled. There had been men in gray coats who spoke through translators and held rolled papers with seals. They said the valley belonged to a trust now, a development that would bring roads and money and safety. The elders argued, the men in coats smiled, and then the fires began on a night with no moon. She remembered the red of it, the way it ran along the dry grass as if it had been waiting for a reason to run. He listened and thought of the old man in the village. He heard the warning again in his mind. The past is not buried. He wondered if the old man had known about the men in coats. He wondered if those men were still around, older and richer and living in houses where night meant clean sheets and quiet. The thought made him angry in a slow, hard way that settled deep. Anger would not help them here, but he held on to it anyway. It felt like a promise. They moved on by mid-morning, following a narrow cut through the rocks that she said would lead to the heart of the ridge. From there, the old paths branched in three directions. One path led to a dry riverbed and a set of watchstones. One led toward the salt flats. One curled back into the cliff like a root seeking water. She believed they had to take the last one. He asked why. She answered that the fires had always tried to erase what people could see. The worst harm hid in places where people could not look without becoming part of the secret. By noon they reached a shaded overhang, with black marks on the ceiling. At first he thought they were smoke stains, but she said they were paint. He stood on a stone and traced the edge of one mark with a stick. The shape formed a bird in flight, long wings stretched wide. Beneath it, a line of small figures held torches that pointed upward. He felt a chill that did not come from the shade. She said the bird crossed the valley the night before everything was taken. Some said it was a good sign. Some said it was a warning. The thing about signs was that they always made sense after it was too late. They rested there and argued for the first time. He told her they needed help, more hands, more eyes. She said more people would only frighten whatever truth remained. He said truth did not frighten easily. She said people did. The words fell between them and left a hard silence. He thought about leaving, if only to make the point that he was not just a blade at her side. The thought passed when he saw the way her hand shook as she untied and retied the simple string around her wrist. He had seen that string before. It had a small bead that looked like bone. He asked where she had gotten it. She said the bead was the last thing her mother held. After that, he said nothing. They pushed into the route path by late afternoon. The air cooled and smelled of old rain and mineral. The rock walls close to them felt wet, even though he knew they were dry. Sound changed in there. Their steps seemed to move away from them in two directions at once, as if the path were a mouth that did not close. He tried to count his breaths to keep focus. He made it to 30 before a voice came from behind them that did not belong to either of them. The voice said his name. He did not turn at first. He felt the hairs on his arms lift and the weight of the knife at his belt settle into his palm. She turned, her face tight, and he followed her gaze. At the bend of the path stood a figure with a staff and a scarf over the lower half of her face. The figure was not tall. The eyes were green and tired. He knew them. It was Nira, the surveyor who passed through the village once a year with maps and stories and a pack that held more tools than seemed possible. Nira pushed down the scarf and smiled in a way that held no joy. She said she had seen their tracks since morning. She said the valley was not a place for two people to wander. He asked how she knew they were there. She said the ridge told her. Then she showed her palm, and there were small lines cut into the skin, a pattern like the circles in the clearing. He did not ask how the cuts got there. He knew a choice had placed them. She pointed her staff at the path ahead and said the route led to the old forge. Not the kind with hammers and anvils, but a forge all the same. She said the valley had been used to shape more than metal. Words could be forged. Traditions could be forged. Memory could be forged. Heat and pressure changed anything that stayed under them long enough. He understood, and he hated that he understood. Nira had a second reason for following. A set of riders had made camp near the salt flats. She had seen their tents and the glare of polished gear. They wore no gray coats, but they carried the same kind of papers. She had watched a man hold a map and point at the ridge the way hunters point at tracks. If they were not already on their way here, they would be soon. The papers would be proof that the riders were allowed to come and take what they liked. It was the same story with a new stamp. The three of them kept moving. She and Nira spoke in short lines that felt like code. He listened and learned that Nira had once trained with her people, not as family but as guest. She had slept in the roundhouses and learned how to read the sky. Later, when the fires came, she used the skill to draw maps so the scattered families could find each other again. Some found each other. Some did not. Nira still carried the names of those who never answered. She said the names out loud when campfires burned low. She said the valley listened differently when names were honored. As they walked, he thought about his own place in this. He was not born to this land. He was a migrant who had washed up in the village after too many seasons of fighting for coin he never kept. He had promised himself a quiet life and then broken that promise the moment she stepped into the tavern and asked for a guide who did not scare easy. He took the job because her eyes had the steadiness he had always wanted and never had. Now he was here, and the quiet life had become a story he might tell later. If there was a later, they reached a chamber where the path widened. The floor dipped in a shallow bowl, and the center held a stained circle that looked like it had once been fire. Around the bowl stood stones with flat faces. Each stone had marks. Not letters he knew, but strokes that hinted at shape and sound. Nira walked the circle once and placed her palm on one of the stones. She said it was a record of an agreement made when the first road was marked across the plain. The agreement said the ridge would remain for the people who kept it. The marks showed the names of witnesses who promised to defend it. Some were their own people. Some were outsiders who had lived in peace long enough to earn a place in the circle. He asked what happened to those witnesses. She said most were dead. Some died in smoke. Some died in the kind of quiet that happens when a person hides and keeps hiding until there is no one left to reach for them. She knelt and told them there was a second record. It was not in the chamber. It had been carried away by a family that fled at the last moment. The father tied the bundle to his chest and swore to bring it back. He never did. The last anyone heard, he was seen far to the west beyond the thorn woods. That was years ago. The bundle was said to hold a woven map, not on paper but on cloth, dyed with plant and ash and laid with threads of copper. A map that showed a path only visible when the ridge shadows lined up in a certain season. The woven map was the key to the forge and the way to undo it. She did not use the word undo lightly. Undoing was a risk. If it went wrong, the valley would split, not in the earth, but in the minds of those who remembered it. They spoke of choices. If the riders came and found only stones and old marks, they would declare the place abandoned. If they found people, they would declare those people trespassers. If they found a woven map, they would take it and claim it in the name of progress. It was a neat plan. Power liked neatness. She said the only defense against neatness was witness. Not just 2 or 3 people, but many. Voices that could not be pushed into a single story. He asked Nira whether anyone else still cared enough to come. She said there were a few. Traders who remembered where they first learned to walk a straight line under the stars. A school teacher who used to bring her students to the ridge to learn about the wind. A mason who taught his children to set stone without mortar the way the ridge taught him. They were not warriors. They were witnesses. That might be enough if they could gather fast. Fast was a problem. The riders were not far, and the salt flats cut sound like a blade. He said he could go back and warn the village. Nira shook her head. If he left, she would have only one person to help her find the proof they needed in the ridge. She needed 2. Some passages were made for pairs because the rock listened for a balance of steps. He started to argue again and then heard the faint rhythm under his boots. The stone had its own logic. He felt it. He let the argument go. They lit a careful flame and studied the marks on the stones. She recognized the signs for season, wind, and path. Nira recognized a marker for water that moved below ground. He saw a rough shape that matched the circles they had found above. When they traced the marks in sequence, a pattern emerged. The path they needed would be hidden under the bowl. Not a hatch. A seam. The seam would open when the bowl sang. The word sang made him uneasy. Nira explained that singing was not a voice but a resonance. If they could make the air in the chamber match the tone of the stone, the seam would loosen. It was the kind of instruction that sounded like legend until you felt the air shift in response to your breath. They tried simple tones first. Low and steady. High and thin. The stone did not respond. She placed her hand on the circle and hummed a line that he had heard from her before when sleep did not come. A lullaby. It wove the rise and fall of breath with a rhythm that felt like steps. He joined in because her voice alone seemed too bare in that space. Nira added a third line that did not match at first and then found a place between. The bowl did not move, but the air in the chamber trembled. Dust lifted. The seam stayed closed. They stopped and he felt the pressure in his chest ease, then return as the wind outside carried the far sound of hooves. Nira cursed under her breath. The riders had found the outer path. They were not in the chamber yet. They were near enough to send a signal through the stone. The signal felt like a cold hand on the back of the neck. They had to decide whether to hide or hold the chamber. Hiding would mean losing the chance to open the seam before the riders found it. Holding the chamber would mean facing men with papers and weapons and to prove their authority. She went to the edge of the bowl and drew a simple shape in the dust, a spiral that ended in a short straight line. It was a sign used by her people when someone stood as keeper of a place for a short time. She placed her palm in the center of the spiral. Nira placed her palm beside it. He looked at them and then set his hand next to theirs. The dust was cool and dry. He felt foolish for a heartbeat and then not foolish at all. They worked fast. Nira set small stones around the bowl at points where sound collected. She told him to stand at one, and she placed the woman at another. Nira took the third. They would try the song again, but this time they would break it into parts the way wind breaks around a cliff. The sound would bounce and fold until it found the seam. If it worked, the seam would loosen enough to show the path below. They would not open it all the way. Not yet. They needed to see before they acted. Proof mattered. Witness mattered. The hooves came closer. Voices echoed in the root path. Men speaking with the steady tone of those who expect to be obeyed. A woman's voice cut across them, sharp and quick. The riders had brought someone who knew the valley's language in a formal way. That meant records. That meant they had studied just enough to be dangerous. He steadied his breath and watched her. She closed her eyes and lifted her chin. Nira nodded to him and began the first line low and rich. He came in on the second, higher and plain. She wove the third line between theirs, carrying the lullaby shape with a firmer spine. The chamber shivered. The stones around the bowl gave a soft, strange reply. The seam did not open, but it became visible, a thin arc that caught the light of their flame like a strand of water. The sight stole his breath. He did not allow himself to stare. The riders were in the passage now. The sound of boots and gear filled the route like gravel poured from a cart. Nira cut the song with a sharp clap. The arc dimmed but did not vanish. She whispered that they had only one chance to show the proof to another set of eyes before it was taken. Not the riders. Witnesses. She pointed at him. He would go to the overhang with the painted bird. From there he could signal the teacher in the town beyond the ridge by lighting a small fire that breathed smoke in 3 short bursts. The teacher watched the ridge every evening. She kept a trunk packed because she believed the day would come when the valley called her back. He did not want to leave. The chamber felt like a place where he had to stand and hold. But Nira was right. Witness mattered more than his pride. She squeezed his shoulder in a way that felt like a transfer of weight. The woman looked at him and said he knew the path now. He nodded even though he doubted his memory. He took the spare flask, the tinder, and the coil of narrow rope. He moved to the shadowed side of the chamber as the first of the riders. Shadows crossed the mouth of the passage. He turned for one last look. She stood calm with her palm on the spiral she had drawn. Nira lifted her staff like a banner. The bowl held the faint line of the seam. The song still hung in the air like a breath not yet released. He slipped into the crack between the stones that Nira had shown him and began to climb toward the overhang, counting his steps, listening for the voices below, and feeling the ridge try to shape him into something he was not sure he had the courage to become. Pressed himself into the narrow gap, moving with care so the sound of stone under his boots would not betray him. Each breath felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself wished to hold him back. Below, the murmur of voices grew clearer. He could hear the sharp commands of a man who seemed certain of his right to be there. The words carried a tone of ownership, as though the chamber and everything it held were already his. He climbed faster, gripping the rope so tight it cut into his palms. The thought of her and Nira standing below with only a flame and the faint line of the seam kept him moving. At last he reached the overhang. The painted bird stretched its black wings above him, stark against the stone ceiling. He set down the flask and tinder, fingers trembling as he struck the first spark. The smoke rose thin and uncertain at first, curling in weak ribbons until he coaxed it into stronger bursts. 3 short plumes rose into the evening sky. He prayed the teacher was watching, that she had not grown tired of waiting for a call that might never come. When the smoke drifted steady, he crouched at the edge of the overhang and peered down into the path below. The riders had reached the chamber. Their lanterns swung, casting wild shadows over the bowl and the stones that circled it. He saw her standing firm with her hand still on the spiral she had drawn. Nira stood beside her, staff raised, voice carrying words he could not make out. The riders spread in a half circle, and one of them unrolled a paper that gleamed in the firelight. The paper was waved like a shield, as if ink on a page could undo what the valley itself had carved. He could not hear every word, but the tone was enough. Authority pressed like a blade, demanding surrender. She shook her head once. Her voice rose, sharp and clear, not in anger but in a kind of calm that stung more than rage. She told them the ridge had witnesses before, and it would have witnesses again. The men laughed, but not all of them. One rider shifted uneasily, his hand tightening on his spear. The man with the paper barked an order. 2 riders stepped forward, boots striking the stone in rhythm. Nira tapped her staff on the ground, and the sound echoed, deeper than it should have. The seam in the bowl flickered, a faint gleam like hidden water. The riders faltered, glancing at one another. Even men who trusted papers knew that stone did not lie easily. From his vantage, he wanted to leap down, to stand beside them, but the smoke signal mattered more. He forced himself to stay hidden, though the strain of it nearly split him. He imagined the teacher seeing the plumes and gathering what she could, calling others, making ready to travel through the night. Still, doubt gnawed at him. What if she had grown weary of hope? What if no one came? The riders pressed closer. One tried to step into the bowl itself, but Nira's staff came down hard across the stone, and the chamber shuddered. Dust fell from the ceiling. The seam brightened again. The rider stumbled back, muttering a curse. The leader raised his hand, signaling restraint, but the anger in his eyes was plain. He wanted the chamber, wanted the record it held, wanted the valley tamed and neat. She began to hum, low and steady. The same lullaby she had sung in the chamber before. The sound wound through the air like a thread, pulling at the stone. Nira joined, her voice carrying weight, grounding the song. The seam glowed brighter, a soft arc against the circle. The riders shifted uneasily, some looking to their leader, others staring at the light. The leader's hand twitched as if torn between fear and pride. Then came the sound of hooves again, faint at first but growing. From beyond the ridge, the teacher and others were on the move. He felt it rather than heard it, a rhythm that did not belong to the riders. He clung to the stone and prayed they would reach the overhang in time. Below, the tension thickened. One rider lifted his spear and pointed it toward her, his voice breaking through the chamber with a demand. She did not stop singing. Her eyes closed, her face serene, as if she trusted the valley more than she trusted the men before her. Nira's grip on the staff tightened, her knuckles white, but her voice never wavered. The seam widened just a fraction, enough for light to leak out, a glow not from fire but from something older. The riders gasped, a sound of men caught between wonder and terror. The leader shouted, trying to regain control, but his voice cracked. From the edge of the chamber, shadows appeared. More figures stepped into the light, not riders but villagers, traders, and strangers who had once called the valley home. The teacher stood at their front, a lantern in her hand. She did not speak, not yet. She only raised the light high, and its glow caught the painted dust spiral at her feet. The valley seemed to breathe in response. The riders turned, caught between 2 fronts. For the first time, their confidence wavered. The papers they carried felt thin in their hands compared to the weight of eyes watching them. The leader barked another order, but fewer voices answered. He saw the crack forming in their unity, a crack that might grow with the right push. The seam pulsed, the glow shifting like a heartbeat. He could not tell if it was about to open or collapse. The air grew hotter, pressing against his chest until it hurt to breathe. She sang louder, and Nira matched her. The chamber shook with the sound, stones trembling, dust raining down. The riders stumbled, and even the villagers flinched, but no one turned away. Every eye was fixed on the seam, waiting. He knew this was the moment the valley had been holding its breath for. Everything balanced on a line thinner than the arc of light itself. One wrong move, one broken note, and the chance could be lost. One more breath, one more beat, and the truth hidden beneath could rise. The clash was inevitable now. He felt it in his bones, in the trembling rope at his side, in the silence that fell between each sound of hooves and song. He pressed his palm to the stone, steadying himself. The climax was near, and the valley itself seemed to lean forward, listening, waiting for the first crack of resolution that none of them could yet see. The glow from the seam grew until it filled the chamber, with a light that was neither fire nor sun. It was a pale gold that shimmered across the stone and touched every face. The riders shielded their eyes, their bravado shrinking under the weight of something far older than their claims. The leader shouted again, but the sound faltered, carried away by the hum of the valley. She held her song steady, her voice rising above the confusion, and Nira pressed her staff into the earth until it quivered with life. The seam cracked open, just enough for the hidden chamber within to reveal itself. The air rushed out like a sigh, carrying with it the scent of earth untouched by time. Symbols glowed along the inner walls, stories etched in stone that no paper could overwrite. The writers stared, their papers drooping useless in their hands. For a moment none dared to move. The villagers and the teacher stepped forward, forming a circle around the seam, their lanterns glowing but paling beside the golden light. The weight of history settled on everyone present, pressing down like truth made solid. The leader tried one last command. His voice broke against the hum of voices rising now from more than just her and Nira. The villagers had joined the song, and even the teacher lifted her voice. It was a chorus built from memory, grief, and hope all bound together. The riders shifted nervously. The man on the ledge could see the fear spread among them like cracks in thin ice. One by one, their spears lowered, their confidence drained away. Only the leader remained defiant, his jaw set, eyes blazing. But even he could not deny what was plain before him. The seam opened wider, and the chamber revealed carvings of ancestors, lines of people standing together with arms linked, eyes turned toward the same horizon. There was no room for doubt. The valley belonged not to the riders, nor to papers waved in the dark, but to those who had remembered and returned. At last the leader dropped the paper. It fell soundlessly onto the stone. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode out. The others followed, silent and broken, leaving behind the echo of hooves fading into the night. Relief spread through the group, though no one cheered. The victory was quiet, heavy with the cost of what it had taken to hold the chamber. She lowered her hand from the spiral, her body trembling with exhaustion, yet her face was calm. Nira leaned on her staff, sweat streaking her brow, but her eyes shone with fierce pride. The teacher approached, placing the lantern near the seam, letting the golden glow wash over her. She nodded once, as if to say that what had been called for was now answered. The man climbed down from the ledge at last, his hands raw and aching, his heart still racing from the sight. He joined them at the seam, unsure if his presence mattered compared to what the others had carried. But when she saw him, she smiled faintly and reached for his hand. That simple touch told him he was part of this, not just a witness. They spent the rest of the night within the chamber. The villagers traced the carvings with their fingers, murmuring stories passed down in fragments, now whole again before their eyes. Nira drew the symbols into her maps, careful and precise, ensuring that even if the chamber sealed again, the memory would not be lost. The teacher gathered the children who had come, telling them softly that this was their inheritance, not to be forgotten or sold away. When dawn came, the seam closed, but not in fear. It sealed with a gentleness that promised it would open again when needed. The spiral of dust remained, glowing faintly as the first light of morning touched it. The riders were gone, but their threat had left a shadow. The valley would not be free forever unless its people stood guard. She looked around at those gathered and spoke plainly. The chamber had shown itself because enough voices stood together. If those voices ever fell silent, the valley would be lost again. The man listened, feeling the truth of her words press into him. He thought of the life he had left behind, of wandering with no root to hold him. Here, in the circle of light and memory, he felt a root take hold. He knew then that he could not walk away. The valley had claimed him as surely as it had claimed her, as surely as it had returned Nira and the teacher. Over the following days, they built watchposts near the ridge, not to keep people out but to keep memory alive. Travelers who came were told the story of the seam and the song that opened it. They were invited to add their voices to the chorus, to carry the truth forward. Slowly, the valley grew not only as a place of land but as a place of belonging. Those who had once left returned with their children. Strangers came, drawn by whispers of a light in the stone. All who arrived were shown the spiral, told of the night when paper and steel bowed to song and memory. The writers never returned. Perhaps they carried shame, or perhaps they waited for another chance. But it no longer mattered. The chamber had been revealed, and the valley had chosen its witnesses. Authority could not erase what the stone had spoken. The villagers knew that vigilance was still needed, but they also knew they had strength enough now to meet whatever came. For the man, life became simple in ways it never had before. Each day he worked beside Nira, helping her mark new paths and record fresh signs. At night he joined her and the teacher in teaching the children to hum the songs, so the valley would always know their voices. He walked with her through the fields, sometimes in silence, sometimes speaking of the past, but always with the comfort that the valley was theirs to guard together. Nira found peace in her maps, knowing that her careful hands would guide others long after she was gone. The teacher carried the role of witness with quiet pride, tending to the spiral and keeping the stories alive. And she, who had once feared the valley's silence, no longer felt alone. The chamber had answered her, and the people had stood with her. The grief she carried for her lost kin softened, transformed into a duty that gave her strength. The valley itself seemed to change. The wind carried a new sound, less mournful, more alive. The fields grew green again where they had been scorched. Streams that had run dry began to flow. It was as if the land, freed from the weight of denial, had chosen to breathe again. Years later, when travelers came and asked why the valley mattered, they were told the story of the night when the seam opened. They learned how voices rose against silence, how light broke through stone, how truth outlasted the weapons of men. Some called it legend, others called it faith, but those who had been there knew it as memory. The man often returned to the ledge where he had sent the smoke signal. He would sit there at sunset, watching the shadows stretch across the ridge. Each time he looked down and saw her near the spiral, he felt the same steady root anchor deeper in his chest. He knew the valley would one day test them again, but he no longer feared it. Together, they had faced the weight of forgetting and refused to bow. The story ended not with triumph shouted across the hills, but with the quiet strength of people who chose to remember. That strength was enough to guard the valley, enough to hold back the claims of those who thought paper could outweigh stone. It was enough to remind anyone who stood on the ridge that belonging was not given by decree, but by the voices that rose together and said, "This is ours." And so the valley remained a place of memory, a place of witness, a place where light could break from stone when voices rose in unity. The man, the woman, Nira, and the teacher became part of that memory. Their names carried in song, their courage etched as deeply as the carvings in the hidden chamber. For anyone who came after, the lesson was clear. Some truths cannot be bought or silenced. Some places will always answer when enough hearts stand together. That was the valley's gift. That was its story. And it would endure as long as there were voices to tell it.